I think that when Putin and Xi Jinping say that Russia-China relationship has never been better than at this moment, I think that they have a point. I would agree with that. And I would say that a lot of people look at this relationship as having a secret sauce named shared animosity towards the United States. And that only if the United States is out of the picture, they will be fighting each other immediately. And I disagree. I think that the US is a very important element here, and the quality of the relationship is very different because both perceive the United States as an enemy, as an adversary, as a competitor in case of China. But I think that there are forces that are driving the two closer to each other, even without the United States. One of them is the need to protect the border and make it a border of peace that doesn't consume so much resources. One way to think about that is that Russia was able to amass troops to invade Ukraine only because it had so few troops on border with China. Never has seen Russia's border with China so few troops in a century since the end of the Russian Civil War in 1920.
Welcome to Navigating Noise podcast, Sasha. It's a real pleasure to have you here with us. When I asked Peter about who we should talk to about to help us understand the China-Russia relationship, he immediately gave me your name. He said, we really need to talk to Sasha here. And it comes to find out, you guys have known each other for a little bit. I'd like to learn a bit, where'd you guys meet? It sounds like there's actually some interesting stories there. Peter, can you tell us a little bit about when you met Sasha?
I think we actually only met once face to face, and that was quite tragically, amusingly. If I remember rightly, it was around 12 years ago. It was during what were known as the Bolotnaya protests. This is when Alexei Navalny, the now deceased Russian opposition leader, was just building his kind of street protests, which were rather huge at that point. It was just when Vladimir Putin was returning or just returned back to the presidency. And there were very large street protests. And I think we were literally sort of having a drink and talking as they were going on, because I remember discussing them. Alexander then was, I still think, the editor of Kommersant which was...
That's right. I was making a transition from the kind of foreign policy reporter and the Kremlin reporter for Kommersant, which was by the time the leading serious newspaper in Russia, the Wall Street Journal of Russia, and was still a quality newspaper, to the role of managing editor for Kommersant, which used to be the Russian Economist, like the most serious weekly. And we met, actually, we didn't have drinks in the Russian sense, but we had some lovely hinkali. We met at a Georgian place.
I think by American standards, it was probably like an alcoholic meeting, and it was like 2 glasses of wine. But yeah, no, there was no like saunas and diving into sort of snow involved.
Is that what it means to have drinks in Russian? Is sauna and diving into snowbanks?
That's not necessarily part of obligatory program, but that definitely involves more than just 2 glasses of wine. Yeah, that's for sure.
In a low trust society, the only way of building solid relationships is for the other person to get so drunk that all the truth vomits out of them.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a sociological reason behind this. It's not just indulgence.
Or you leak some information and then see whether that goes out, and you say but it's only for you. And if you notice that after 3 times, the information is kept between the two of you, then you develop just a little bit of trust. And that's how the sources start to talk to you a little bit more.
But frankly, that's pretty much how leaking works everywhere, I think.
Well, I was wondering if you're giving us a roadmap back to civic trust in America. Just drinking a lot and I guess sharing secrets with each other and seeing whether others keep it.
If you look at Russia, though, this method, which is supposed to build trust, doesn't really work. Russia remains a low trust society, and the trust is definitely in deficit. Well, the booze is not.
So maybe the Russian method is not one that we want to adopt right now. We could try some others.
But by the way, the Chinese society is exactly the same. I think that my experience in Russia and in the Kremlin press corps has prepared me very well to deal with the Chinese. Well, I'm a China watcher by background, but my consumption of alcohol during my time as a student in China is just dwarfed by my professional drinking consumption in China. Unfortunately, recently the amount of booze goes up, but the quality of information you exchange goes down significantly. But definitely that's a society that works closely, and that's where the Russians and Chinese actually can get together somewhat better than with some of the Western peers. Minus the Irish. Never drink with the Irish.
That segues very nicely into our topic, which is Russia-China relations. Because Alexander, apart from being a very well-known journalist and editor, is also, I think, fluent in how many Chinese dialects and languages?
Oh, I only speak Mandarin, and now it's pretty, like, it is rusty. I need to clean it up because COVID and lack of travel to China really does it no good, unfortunately. Now living in Berlin, leading Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center in Berlin brought back to life my German, which was my first foreign language, but not my Mandarin. So I'm working on it again.
Yeah, well, I guess, just like Peter said, like our topic here today is trying to understand the China-Russia relationship there. I guess if you could give us a sense of about like how special is the current relationship when you kind of look back in, not like the long history, obviously that's complicated over, kind of the centuries time frame, but, in the post-war era, is the relationship that we've kind of seen them at least publicly announce, is that has that moved really into a new period of it? And what's new about it?
I think that when Putin and Xi Jinping and multiple officials below them in the pyramid say that Russia-China relationship has never been better than at this moment, and they've been constantly saying this for couple of years now, so it seems that they are improving. I think that they have a point. I would agree with them. Since the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949 with a massive Soviet help, and then the relationship with the Communist Party and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was ambivalent. Stalin was not necessarily a very big fan of supporting Mao Zedong in the Civil War, but that was history and water under the bridge once Mao got successful with massive Soviet help. So the first period, which is kind of the brilliant period of romantic love between the two dictatorships, I think was based on a lot of assumptions that were never real, a lot of idealism mixed with crudest form of cynical pragmatism. And I think that right now, after all of the bumps and a kind of pretty scary border war that involved a lot of blood being spilled on the border between Soviet Union and China in two places, and like real nuclear scare, both countries were actually preparing to nuke each other. I think that gave way to a relationship right now that's much more cynical, pragmatical, and clear-eyed about each other. I think that this kind of rosy, outsized expectations of the 50s and early 60s are gone to an extent. And I would say that a lot of people look at this relationship as having a secret sauce named shared animosity towards the United States. And that only if the United States is out of the picture, they will be fighting each other immediately. And I disagree. I think that the US is a very important element here. And the quality of the relationship is very different because both perceive the United States as an enemy, as an adversary, as a competitor in case of China. And if the United States is indeed out of the picture, we might have a very different quality of the relationship. But I think that there are forces that are driving the two closer to each other, even without the United States. So there are, to me, at least three pillars of this relationship that predate the animosity with the United States. One of them is the need to protect the border and make it a border of peace that doesn't consume so much resources. After the Sino-Soviet split in the 70s, they put hundreds of thousands of troops on ready bases in Siberia and in northeast China, Dongbei. They were pointing nuclear weapons at each other, and they realized that it's just very costly and very risky to keep the relationship like that. So the drive to sort out the territorial dispute, normalize the ties to the extent that they can reallocate this military resources in the case of Soviet Union, or spend more money on economic development rather on defense in case of China, actually predates Putin, Xi Jinping, Hu Jintao, and others. It started in early 80s. Andropov's advisors contemplated normalizing relationship with China, and then Gorbachev really embarked on that. So in a way, Putin has inherited China policies of his predecessors, Boris Yeltsin and Mikhail Gorbachev, and Xi Jinping inherited policies of Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin, and Deng Xiaoping before that. So the need to really not make this border a border of tensions, but rather a border of peace with not necessarily 100% satisfying outcome of the border resolution. But the value of having a peaceful relationship is much bigger than chunks of territory that these two Asian societies will get in a maximalist outcome. One way to think about that is that Russia was able to amass troops to invade Ukraine only because it had so few troops on border with China. Never has seen Russia's border with China so few troops in a century since the end of the Russian Civil War in 1920. And I think that this is something that is likely to stay. We can discuss whether China presents a real challenge to the Russian territorial integrity, but I think that this is one of the pillars that is there. That's pretty old. It definitely predates the current leadership, and it has aged well. The other two pillars, very briefly, is the economic complementarity. Russia has abundance of natural resources, lacks technology, lacks investment, lacks infrastructure. China is the exact opposite. And for centuries and then decades, Russia, Soviet Union, and then Russia again have put all of the eggs into European basket, where the boom and demand for commodities in China was ignored for various reasons. And then it also started only around 1994. You remember that before 94, China was exporting oil rather than importing. So this is in theory, a match made in heaven, and Russia could have tremendous opportunities to diversify away unilateral dependence on Europe and build a new market for itself in Asia Pacific, but then focused on China. And then finally, both regimes are not democracies. That was not so true under Yeltsin, but they share a lot of common outlook on the notion of sovereignty and sovereignty on the internet. So the approaches that they take to issues of global governance are pretty similar naturally. And when they are permanent members of the UN Security Council, they bring together similar optics to that relationship. So the similarities of political setup, the economic complementarity, and the need to keep the border at peace would be the three fundamentals to me that would exist and make sure that this partnership works. It's not perfect. And what makes it to the current state of like much deeper partnership that both would pursue under normal circumstances, that's not the marriage of convenience that both have chosen voluntarily, is really the perception that the United States is challenged to their regime, security, and national greatness.
One of those that's stronger than the other? I mean, are there and how would you rank them and do they both rank them similarly? Is Russia actually looking and saying actually our economic complementarity is number one, and that's what's driving us to whereas China's might be, it's setting up it's because we have this governance overlap with not being democracies, or not being democracies of the kind that the U.S. Has largely defined there. How would you rank them, and do they agree on their rankings?
The hierarchy is definitely there. It's clear that China is a senior partner in this relationship. China is stronger. It has much more leverage. It still has many more options than Russia has. And I think that Russia was progressively reducing availability of options by illegally annexing Crimea, starting war in Donbass, getting massive Western sanctions, and then doing the next logical step, invading Ukraine in February 22, and getting ostracized by the Western world, and making a situation where you might not recognize Western sanctions as a country. And you say, like, they are illegal, but you cannot fully ignore them. And that's what Russia learned with its relationship with China, Turkey, India, and many others, that the US sanctions are actually biting, even with those countries that don't recognize them formally. So I think that here, China obviously is a much larger economy. It has much stronger science, innovation, and tech, which is really the crux of influence in the 21st century. It's bigger population, and it's a military that's rapidly expanding. I think that one metrics where Russia was stronger and still remains stronger was like it has larger nuclear arsenal, but China is building up its nuclear stockpile at rather neck-breaking speed, where probably by 2035 it will stand more or less close to where the US and Russia are. And I think that in terms of quality of the military, well, Chinese is definitely not battle tested. Like, China has not fought a war since 79, but it's definitely a larger army, a much more technological army with a larger navy, larger space force. And on most of the metrics, Russia is inferior to China. But they've chosen to not publicly discuss this issue of hierarchy and leverage. The Chinese all the time, like in Chinese language, there is no word for brother. There is word brothers, like 兄弟, but it has two words like the elder brother and the younger brother. So there is all the time 兄 or弟弟, like the younger brother. And the Chinese say, like, oh, we won't go into the discussion who is the elder brother, who is younger brother. In Soviet era, like in the 50s, they had this expression, elder brother Soviet Union, 苏联大哥. Now, definitely, when you talk to the Chinese in private, after a lot of alcohol consumption, that's where we started, you would, like, respect towards Russia is not there most of the time. People would say, like, yeah, you've been this 苏联大哥, you've been this great superpower, second only to the United States, and you've squandered all of these opportunities by this messy dissolution of the Soviet Union, massive corruption, massive inefficiency. Like, you produce girls that you export to China, raw materials, like arrogant oligarchs, but not that much more that we will envy or want to have. And I think that it's a pretty stark assessment. I would disagree to some parts of that, but I think that it's pretty clear, right? So there is no respect lost unless you bump into somebody who would be a fan of Russian culture, or like more an old guard, somebody who studied in the Soviet Union and still has a lot of respect. But Chinese know that Russians have a huge ego. It's better not to trump on this ego. It's better to massage this ego. And with little sprinkles of praise, you can get a lot of things done in Russia. And they say the mistake of the West is that they were insensitive to this Russian ego. They thought that if they took the Russians into G8 and so on, but they were talking down to them in terms of democracy and so on, that was like the way to establish mutually beneficial relationship with a lot of respect. That's not the case in Russia. We're smarter than that.
What's even from DC in DC, where I'm currently based, there seems to be sort of two dream scenarios about this relationship. One of them, which is indulged by people like Vivek Ramaswamy, is like, we should just make peace with Russia and spirit it away from China, give them Ukraine, doesn't matter. You know, we need to break up this relationship. And the other one, which hopes that by showing the costs of its relationship with Russia, China maybe doesn't abandon Russia, but grows cooler in that relationship. Listening to you, it seems neither one of those approaches is particularly feasible. Or is there one that does have more impact? And if it's not those two, does one just abandon it and say, okay, this is now a single unit, and we must look at it as I don't know what the right word is. Alliance is apparently not the right word. Partnership, access. I don't know which word do you even use.
Well, I think I use alignment or whatever. Like, it's not an alliance. I will be very surprised if we're going to reach a stage where they give each other Article 5 type of guarantees or like real commitments, like the alliances of the 19th and early 20th century. If you look into the secret part of the Entente, right, how many divisions you will mobilize if your alliance partner is under threat of invasion. I think that Article 5 is much more vaguely framed, and that adds to a lot of concern of what countries will actually do if an alliance member is invaded. So I think that giving each other this treaty type of guarantees, for example, the ones that Russia has with North Korea now, and you see already an impact of this agreement on the battlefields, definitely in Kursk region of Russia, but probably in occupied territories of Ukraine itself. And you see that in provision of shells, materials, and so on that Pyongyang is given. So I will be surprised, absent a major worsening of relationship between China and the United States, that we're going to see something like that. But it's definitely much deeper than just a shallow, tactical partnership that can be abandoned at any moment. And I think that this is not the relationship that both sides have voluntarily chosen. I think that Russia really wanted to be part of the West to an extent, a little bit outside, definitely on its terms, second only to the United States, but into the Western family, integrated as somebody who would have a say at the table. And that was definitely very naive because American alliances have a very clear boss. And like when Russians realize that A, they will not be accepted to that for that particular reason, B, that's something that won't work for them, they're trying to destroy the whole system of European security and dethrone the United States. But I think for a very long time in China, there was this hope that China will be strong enough to, have this 19th century concept of sphere of influence, and Asia will fall into China's sphere of influence, but the world is big enough for the US and China to coexist. And I think that they realized that once they got really a threat to some of the allies and competitor to the US will get organized to put a lot of pressure and to not allow China to race to this position where it will be able to compete and undercut US interests. So that realization, which is partially driven by their relationship with the US, brought them together in a partnership where they don't necessarily feel 100% comfortable. But I think that there is a realization that there is no way back to the place where you could have a different relationship with the US, unless the Americans change their mind, which I don't think is feasible either with regard to Russia. Well, I hear that a lot of people say we need to do Kissinger in reverse. But that doesn't seem feasible. And unless the US is willing to compromise a lot in Europe, including its own credibility. And that necessarily will lead to changes in Russia's attitude towards China, that Russia will completely throw its relationship with China under the bus. If you talk to the Russians, they say, well, one administration may try that. But how much this approach will stick, knowing that the pendulum of the US political polarization is going? How much can these politicians be trusted? In Cold War era, there was some consistency around the US national interest. But now the definition of this very interest is so different between Republicans and Democrats. Like one team negotiates JCPOA with Iran, another team walks out of that. One team builds the Paris Climate Accord, another team says that this is constrained to the US energy security and walks away with that. So there is not that much trust in long-term consistency of US foreign policy on the Russian side. And I think that on the Chinese side, they believe, and they, in my mind, not entirely wrong, that the US will get out to get them. And the relationship with the US will get worse before it gets worse. In a Trump way, tariffs, like more avert military support to Taiwan, or the Democrats' way, more focused on limiting Chinese ability to innovate, the export controls, and so on. And that's what drives them. So I think that, Peter, whether it's smart to look at them as this one entity, I think that's unfortunately a pretty solid approach. And I meet increasing number of US policymakers who say, well, that's not the best world, but this is the much more comfortable world for us. We know how to navigate. We know how to build this dual containment. It's a lot of resources that we take, but that's much more feasible and rooted in how the real world operates than trying to steal one party from the other, unless we can really kind of put them into a place that we want, for China to be just a second tier player, not where the United States is, and for Russia to fundamentally change and become a democracy that is at peace with its neighbors.
So so that seems like this seems accurate to me. This assessment here, but I guess hearing you talk, I'm kind of thinking, well, even within our own alliances, there are tensions. There are things that drive us apart. There's you talk to someone in diplomatic circles or people who are kind of doing intelligence sharing with the US and the UK. They'll use special relationship pretty euphemistically every now and then to think that, well, yes, of course, there's this general alignment, but there's a lot of tension at times that they have to navigate. And I guess I'm kind of wondering, you talk to us about what drives Russia and China together. There's internal things to the relationship. There's obviously the U.S. Context, but what are the things that actually could potentially drive them apart? Where are those tensions or sorts of, or places of competition between them as well that might not rise to the level of adversarial relationship or anything like that? But how would you characterize the internal tension?
I think that the major source of potential tensions is this asymmetry in leverage that's expanding. It's not static. China gets stronger and has more leverage over Russia much faster, thanks to the stupid and criminal war that Putin has launched, partially. But I think that was the trend line anyway. Russia was not a dynamic economic powerhouse anymore. It was in anemic growth territory where China was rapidly expanding. And yes, China is having its own headwinds and problems in the economy. There are structural problems. There are problems brought by Xi Jinping management style. But nevertheless, Russia is smaller in GDP terms than Guangdong province. It's probably in the territory of Shandong province and moving gradually towards Hunan, where COVID originated. And with that leverage, the question is, what will China do about that? I think that for now, China is very careful in using this leverage and squeezing out conditions in bilateral deals that will be seen by Russia as street robbery. China uses its leverage and pushes Russia into the corner, but gently. And there is one element where China doesn't do that, and these are deals with Putin's cronies, people who are in the room where China policy is discussed. They want to make sure that everybody who is at this China table in the Kremlin is happy with the Chinese and tells Putin that, boss, they are the best. They really respect you. And that's because they have a personal stake in this relationship. Other than that, you talk to a lot of business people in Russia, be it kind of senior oligarchs of the previous generation who are in their 70s, oligarchs of the younger generation, medium-sized enterprise. And they say, well, China is really difficult to have business with, A, because it's a very different culture, but also B, because they have so many more options and they are not kind of giving us any preferential treatment. And I think that here there is this mismatch between the political rhetorics that we are best friends and the reality that China is actually very pragmatic and it cares about its interest first and foremost, right? And that's the, I think, tension that you describe in any alliance, including the special relationship between UK and the US, has the same nature, right? You have your interests closer at heart. So, but I think that Chinese so far are pretty delicate about that. The question is, what will be there in 5-10 years if Russia maintains this horrible war? It's sanctioned like North Korea. It's definitely much more powerful than North Korea, but it at the mercy of the Chinese, and Chinese are the backbone for demand on Russian commodities. Anything that's imported in Russia mostly originates in China. Backbone of tech development in Russia is China. China has all the strongest cards. What will China demand in return? And I think that's a question very much on the Russian decision makers' mind previously. But now, since everybody is in this tunnel vision because of them, and it's just very hard to figure out how genuine that is. And again, talking to people and getting their sense and what they genuinely believe is increasingly harder. You would require a lot of alcohol and physical presence, which is not necessarily like, I'm based in Berlin now. I'm seeing some people outside of Russia occasionally. But it's very hard to navigate. Like my experience before Carnegie was outlawed and unwelcomed in Russia right after the war was that senior people in the government I talked to, like very senior cabinet secretaries level, people who talk to Putin on regular basis, would say, oh, we disagree with this point, Sasha, that this leverage gap, an increasing leverage gap, creates risks for Mother Russia going forward. Because their justification would be, well, we had this leverage gap with Europe and with the West. And when push came to shove, when we really needed to draw a clear red line of where our national interests are in Crimea, we managed to do that. And then we are not so dependent on China. We don't have this discrepancies and differences about ideology anymore. So we are fine. But continue speaking about this. And it's good that Carnegie kind of writes this. And we have been one of the major hub on China watching in Russia because it's useful. And there are some people who are just having these rosy ideas. So these conversations were there. I don't hear them anymore, both private and public. But I assume that a lot of senior decision makers who understand that this war, apart from being immoral and criminal, was a just huge strategic mistake. Russia was in the best of universes where China and the US get into a deeper confrontation, and Russia could have a normal relationship with both superpowers, be not aligned and reap benefits on both sides. And Russia squandered this opportunity altogether. So I think that people are worried, what will China use that leverage for 5-10 years down the road? That's one element. Second element, there is this historic distrust and there is a lack of understanding of each other because the cultures are so different. And the Russians have not been exposed to China that much over many years. There was Sino-Soviet split. There was sinology that studied China more as a potential adversary. And then in the 90s, everybody pivoted away to kind of learn Western languages, do business with Europeans and so on. And there is kind of this very Russian complex of cultural inferiority that we are part of the family in the West, but we are not accepted. And that's why sometimes we behave as a bully. But you want to belong to this club, be it nice little dachas in southern France and little houses in Belgravia, London, or be it the sunny island in Miami. I think that's where people put their money, their kids, and that's where they wanted to belong. China is not necessarily dreamland for these people. I have met people who are just very rich and are in love with China, with Chinese culture, but I think it's a new phenomenon. It's gradually emerging, but it's still in its infancy. And on the Chinese side, I think that most of the people I meet have disrespect towards Russia as a state and a system, though they might be in love with Russian culture and elements of that. So this distrust and this lack of kind of coherence, common language, and so on might be a source of friction going forward because a lot of moves might be misinterpreted. Russia felt much more comfortable and at home with the Europeans, actually, than with the Chinese. That might change. I know a lot of people who are learning Mandarin, who speak terrific Mandarin, a lot of members in the elite who hire this tutors who live with their kids and teach them Mandarin from the childhood. And it's like in Tolstoy, you remember that in Anna Karenina, like it starts with the French exchange, and like a lot of Russian aristocracy members started to speak French earlier than they started to speak Russian. I don't think that we will arrive there. And like people who teach their kids Mandarin also teach them English. But in 20 years' time, if things are the same, there will be just a bigger generation of people who have much more interpersonal connection with the Chinese. And Chinese are also busy on allowing Russians to come, to get degrees, to spend good time in China on lavish scholarships and invest into this connection between the societies. But again, I would point that as a source of friction.
So we had a couple of sort of like discrete events recently. I'd love to know how they were treated in China among the sort of discourse that you track. One is the BRICS meeting, which is obviously, being held up by Putin as an example of how Russia is at the hub of an alternative network to the West. And then, well, let's start with that one. How was that actually discussed in China? And is there a gap between, I don't know, the official pronouncements and what business elites talk about? Do they even talk about it at all?
They do. And I think that inside the original BRIC, we have this tension between two families now. One family is Russia and China that really want to gradually turn BRICS into the alternative club that's non-West and increasingly anti-West, led by China, obviously, but where Russia plays a willing second fiddle to the Chinese ideas about BRICS. And that's not what China originally wanted. China originally wanted redistribution of votes inside the Bretton Woods system that would empower China in accordance to the current rules. I think that now, if you read carefully Xi Jinping's speeches, there is much more anti-colonial, anti-Western undertones that make them similar to what Russia wants. And like the whole idea to expand BRICS, to bring as many countries as possible on the platform with Iran and others, is both originating from Moscow and Beijing. So they are very much in sync. I think that where they are not in sync is that when Russia tries to portray itself as this leader of anti-Western, Putin sometimes says that it's not an anti-bloc, and that, we are at the spearhead of this conflict with the West, and that everybody understands our reason to fight in Ukraine. That's the kind of first war against Western hegemony. And like, you read the Chinese commentary on that, and like there is a public version, there is also a private version that goes into the system. And you talk to people who write that, and they say like, no, this actually is a very stupid war. Like if you are a rational player, you wouldn't do anything to that. And that's why Chinese were very surprised, to my knowledge, about the start of the war. They never expected Russia to do something so reckless and strategically stupid, even if they would be successful and would take Kiev in 3 weeks. But I think that this shared interest is there. And like the different camp is obviously Brazil, India, and other countries that don't want it to be an anti-Western bloc. And here we have some tensions.
So you just brought up this one thing about like how like the Chinese are viewing Russia's war in Ukraine here. And obviously, the sanctions are starting to kind of like reverberate into China itself. And what we noticed in our analysis of kind of using our platform Telespan to like track attitudes in China, particularly to Russia here, was that there was a very significant drop in sentiment towards Russia around when those sanctions were really starting to be discussed in there. And I'm kind of like wondering, is that how deep did that go? To sense like we caught that, and like there's obviously some negative coverage in the Chinese media, which would be representative of a kind of a more regime perspective. But also when we looked at other perspectives, there was like a lot of people who kind of just normal everyday Chinese who were like all of a sudden very negative towards Russia. I guess like, is that like a little blip that they're going to absorb that? Or is this something that actually creates something of a tension that you could see growing over a longer period of time between the two countries?
Are we talking the 22 original sanctions or the latest 24 kind of more China-focused sanctions that
It's
go
the
after
one
Chinese?
where
Okay.
basically we're going to start to sanction the financial institutions as well, and that exposed China's banking sector to sanctions.
I think there are several layers. China definitely was free riding on the sanctions and was getting a lot of stuff from Russia and a huge market in Russia, at least for some industries. Like Russia is not a very big market, but it's a sizable market. And for example, combustible engine cars, that's the largest market outside of China. Where do you put all of these legacy cars, right? They go with BYD and electric vehicles to developed markets, but they dump a lot of this stuff into Russia. Russians still buy it because they don't have any alternatives. So I think that as long as China was free riding, that was popular. Now there are costs attached. People are starting to think otherwise and just get angry and say, oh, that produces risks for us. And here I sense two schools of thought that also use this conversation about Russia and the sanctions as a Aesopian way to talk about Xi Jinping and his foreign policy. They say like, look, but we are increasing our tensions with the Europeans and the West. They're so angry at us because of our support to Russia. And this is the reason. And if we only could shift these policies and like you just look at the importance of healthy relationship with the West and relationship to Russia towards our long-term economic strategy, it's clear which is more important. Like the West definitely is. It's a bigger trading partner, it's a source of investment, it's a source of technology. And the West gets skeptical in China because of our support to Russia, which is indirect criticism of Xi Jinping foreign policy in general. So if we could only undo Xi Jinping's Russia policy, and then the subtext is also undo Xi Jinping's foreign policy, and get back to Hu Jintao era, where, you know, we were this giant, cute panda and so on, things would be much better. And people hope that it's an aberration driven by Xi Jinping. And I think that it's partly that, like as like putting my analyst cap on, I would say like, yeah, personality and policy preferences matters, but like all of these aircraft carriers, all of these military capabilities started to be built under Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, while China was opening up. Probably China never intended to be this toothless, giant, fat cat and not a tiger, right? And there is this discussion. They all the time wanted to be just a healthy predator, and they realized that economy, technology, human capital comes first. But then on top of that, you need to build a military muscle to not be pushed around. That was part of the plan from the very beginning. At least that's what the actions of the Chinese government suggest. So Xi Jinping made it worse. He made it much more emotional. But even if you go back to Hu Jintao, probably given how big, powerful China is now, how advanced it is in AI and like all of the technologies that will define the 21st century, how advanced Chinese electric vehicles are compared to Volkswagen, that would make the West angry, or at least doubtful about you should deepen this partnership with China anyway. But this is one camp. The other camp, I think, are people close to Xi Jinping who say like, look, but West is angry not at our Russia policy, it's angry at us. We're too big, too powerful. Look at their attitude towards India busting the sanctions or buying Russian oil. They're doing much more from nearly zero, like less than 2% of imported oil to India before the war came from Russia. Now it's around 50%. Where is the same amount of Western criticism towards India? Oh, they don't criticize Indians so loudly because India part of contain China camp. It's part of Quad. It's the largest democracy in the world. Why are they kind of not so vocal about Modi's domestic politics, it's because India is useful in policy to contain China. So no matter what we do with Russia, if we throw Russia under the bus, and then tomorrow, Navalny's wife, Yulia Navalny, is president of Russia, and says, "Oh, we want to abandon this partnership with China. We want to join NATO. We, have referendums in all of the ethnic minority republics and all of that." What's the benefit to China? What do we get in return from the Americans, except for tap on the shoulder saying, "Good boy, China. Now, what about Taiwan? What about Xinjiang? What about Chairman for Life Xi Jinping?" And I think that they say, okay, we don't have any other realistic option as to continue to invest in Russia not losing this war. We are probably agnostic whether Putin captures Kyiv or not, but we definitely cannot afford this regime to go bust and be replaced by a democratic, liberal, pro-Western regime. And then everything what comes as a threat to us through sanctions and so on would come our way regardless anyway, maybe later. And we don't need to push it too hard to alienate the West too much, too fast. But we also need to take it as antibodies, as a vaccine on how to learn to sanction-proof our own economy. So I know that they have dispatched some teams to Russian government to talk to very smart folks in the Central Bank of Russia, in the Ministry of Finance, like, how do you do this sanction management? How do you navigate? How do you make your system more immune? And I think that there is a lot of lessons that China can learn from that. Well, China is much more interwoven into the global economy. The sanctions will hurt China much more than they hurt Russia. But at the same time, China also has much more leverage to impose pain on the sanctions coalition.
Are we looking at a world in which sanctions are likely to be less effective in the future? That there's been enough out there that they've kind of learned how to work around. There's almost like a set of shared practices. Or maybe there's an alternative system now that the US and maybe Western reliance on sanction regimes might not get the return that they have in the past.
It's a trade-off. I think that the emergence of China as the number 2 global economy with very sophisticated technology, it might be one generation later, the arrival and the deployment, but nevertheless, China is doing a lot. China has the scale. It can do quantity as well. Instead of the cutting-edge chips, you use 2 older generation chips and you have the same compute. So China has the ability to compete there. And I think that for now, nothing threatens the primacy of US dollar, for example. In the short to medium term, which is another 10, 15 years, there is simply no alternative that's so easy to use, that's so familiar, countries that have this depth of capital markets that the US has. And a lot of these other countries have currency that's controlled, capital account is closed. So bringing BRICS together on one platform to have, for example, alternative of SWIFT is something that Russia tried, but it failed. And it not only failed because it's a sanctioned country, nobody wants to do something when Russia is president, but it's because it's very hard practically. But then many countries are starting to think into that direction, looking at the sanctions overdrive and frankly at the fiscal position of the United States, given the mounting debt and the mounting deficit. Will people believe that it's sustainable because the US can just print US dollars and inflate the budget deficit forever? I don't think so. So they don't have a solution, but they're looking for various solutions that will provide them with a hedge. And I think that long term, that's definitely a problem for the United States. But short term, the sanctions can bite, they can impose cost, and Russia being able to still wage this war in year 3, but at the same time feeding the heat, the interest rates of 21 doesn't signal a very healthy economy. I think that's to the success of the sanctions policy. They do actually impose costs, though they are not silver bullets.
Yeah. There's a lot more. We'd love to talk to you here, and we're kind of near the end of our time. But just what you touched on there probably is worth a future conversation around about these sanctions. I think there was a thought that they might be a silver bullet, or it was an unstated aspiration for them. at times, but they clearly haven't been that. But like you're saying, there might still be some effectiveness to them. They do raise the costs. They could slightly shift the calculus on some decisions. But so could you tell our viewers how people can follow you or kind of learn about any of the reports and analyses that you produce?
Sure. Like Carnegie Endowment has a webpage, and I think everything that I publish, be it for Carnegie or for outside outlets, the Financial Times, New York Times of this world, is collected there. I'm not as active on Twitter or X as I used to be, which I think is common trait for many of us who are frustrated with the platform. But I put out stuff there. I do a podcast too, but it's just very narrowly focused on Russia and Central Asia, South Caucasus, Ukraine, Belarus to an extent. It's Carnegie Politica where I'm the host. And that would be it.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you very much for your time. This has been really a fascinating conversation.
Thanks for having me. It was great fun.